Welcome to the Bywords Show. I'm your host, Hannah Hughes. Bywords is all about equipping women for purposeful living by starting conversations, celebrating stories, and inspiring faith. In a world that applauds the hustle, I'm here to help you break free from the lies and come back to what really matters. It's time to get real, get rooted in truth, and come alive in relationship with Jesus so you can show up to each day with intention and confidence no matter where you're at in your story. Here we believe that embracing our stories brings hope, healing, and purpose to the process, and sharing our stories helps others do the same. Whether you're looking for a midweek faith refresh, practical tools for pursuing your dreams, or just need some good old-fashioned girl talk, you're in the right place. Grab your latte and let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Bywords Show. Today is the day. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so excited today to introduce you to Clarissa Mole. She's got this beautiful testimony in this story, and she's walked through a lot with the Lord. And so we're going to get into some heavy topics today, like loss and grief. So I just want to put that out there first. Obviously, the title is probably going to let you know what we're talking about today, but I'm really grateful that you're here, Clarissa. And I'm just so thankful that you have shared your story and can't wait to get to chat with you about all this.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Hannah.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, we have a lot to dive into today, but before we do, I always ask our guests our icebreaker question. So here it is, just to kick us off. What is filling your cup lately? Literally, what's in your cup? What do you like to drink? And then figuratively, what's filling your cup?
Ooh, well, in the cup that's beside me right here by my podcast mic is it's kind of embarrassing. It is room temperature coffee, black room temperature. I didn't even bother to stick ice in it this morning. I didn't bother to heat it up. It is yesterday's coffee that I am just drinking because I love my cup of coffee.
That's
So
so real.
that is what is filling me up, literally. But what is filling me up these days is just enjoyment of this new season in life. I've just launched 2 kids into college, and so our house is beginning to empty, and it's
Wow.
bittersweet, but I'm trying to lean into that bittersweetness and catch a vision for what comes next and what the joy of today brings, even as I'm thinking, gosh, I hope they're doing their laundry and I hope you got ready for class this morning. It's easy to have my mind be elsewhere. So I'm really leaning into this present moment and what God might have in store for this next season for me.
Wow, I love that. That's a really, really crazy and exciting. I can't even imagine. My son just started kindergarten this year. So I'm like, oh man, that's coming faster than I
Yeah.
know because this got here way too fast. But oh my goodness, wow, what a whirlwind.
Mhm.
So I'm excited to get into your story. And I love that you even mentioned bittersweet because as I've like heard some of your story and some of your writing, like that's what I've really thought of. And even in my own life with grief and loss, like there is such this bittersweet to it, like this hope we have in the Lord. And then also we have this grief, like we have this pain that we carry with us through this life on earth. And so we're going to break this down today and unpack a lot of your story and how we process all of this. So, do you want to just start us off by sharing a little bit of your journey and how you got to where you are today?
Sure, yeah. Well, if you had met me about 10 years ago, I would have introduced myself as a homeschooling mom of 4. My husband and I had been married for a long time, and we loved an adventurous life. We liked to travel, to be outdoors. My husband was a telecommuter, so that allowed us to do a lot of traveling. We lived in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and it's just a gorgeous place to live with mountains and ocean all around. And that was my life. And I thought that it probably would be my life for the rest of my life, watching those homeschooled schooled kids grow up and find lives of their own. But in 2019, my life entirely shifted when 2 chaplains arrived at our campsite in the middle of our family vacation to let me know that my husband had fallen to his death in the backcountry of Mount Rainier National Park. He had headed out that morning for a hike with a climbing partner of his, and he wasn't ever coming home, the chaplain said. I was now a widow. I had 4 kids to raise alone. And of course, that shattered all the visions that I had, not just for the present, but for the future. And so
Yeah.
these last 6 years have been grappling with that reality, learning to live with grief as an unwelcome companion, and also finding a way to write the story forward, to find a way to actually live again and not just survive this horrible thing that really interrupted the narrative of our life as we see it, but we know came as no surprise to God.
Wow. I relate so much to that. And I'm so sorry for your loss. And I hate that anyone has to have grief as part of their story.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, this is not something that there's much conversation about. And we kind of don't know what to do with it until we're right in the middle of it. For you, like in your book, Beyond the Darkness, you talk about some of the lies that the world has taught us about grief. Could you talk about some of those? And then what is the truth that Christians need to know instead?
Yeah, when my husband died, I was confronted with all kinds of things that I thought I knew about grief that ended up not being true as I tried to wade my way through the
Mhm.
slog of sorrow that came after he died. I learned that I was wrong, that what doesn't kill you doesn't necessarily make you stronger. Sometimes
Mm.
it totally breaks you. Sometimes it makes you feel like you did die, even if you
Yeah.
were lying there on the ground. I learned that there was no one right way to do grief, that different cultures, different generations enacted grief in a variety of ways. And that if I wanted to be healthy as someone who is trying to process this in the 21st century as a mom with 4 kids, I was allowed to pick and choose from different cultures and different generations and find the way that grief made most sense to me to manifest. Another thing that I realized pretty quickly was that grief wasn't going to end. It wasn't this 5 or 7 step process at which the end I would receive a certificate of completion and perhaps a little bit of a medal because I had worked so
Right.
hard through the whole thing. Nope, this wasn't even a marathon. This was a long walk toward the horizon. That horizon being Jesus coming again, that I would grow through my grief. I would integrate my grief into the life that now lived without Rob. I would experience joy again, but I'd always have grief beside me as I moved about in that life without him. And it behooved me then to get to know that grief, to listen to
Mm.
it instead of running away, to give it space instead of kind of sequestering it or compartmentalizing it so it fit everyone else's expectations. And
Yeah.
also pay attention to its wisdom, because if loss and sorrow does anything for us, it takes away the blinders, it reshifts our priorities and helps us to clarify our values. And grief has done all of those things for me. I'm really
Mm.
grateful that those lies were pretty well dispelled in the first few months after Rob died, because what it did for me was open up a landscape that actually allowed me to live out my faith in a way that would draw me closer to the Lord, would allow
Wow.
me to ask serious questions to God that may or may not receive answers, and to find solace in God's people at a time where grief was so isolating that it could have easily kept me home and at a distance from people who could love and serve me well.
That's so beautiful and equally hard to do.
Mhm.
Like when you're in it, it's so hard to see beyond the pain. I mean, at first it's the shock and then, you have to process through it. And I think the way you mentioned, like it doesn't just go away.
Yeah.
I think sometimes when we experience pain or grief or loss, we're like, okay, what do I need to do to get better? How do I ever even move on from this? First of all, like, is there a life after this? And if there is, how do I get there? But it is something that we continue to carry with us. So I think it's really beautiful and interesting that you learned kind of to walk with that, and also the way that it kind of shaped your faith. Could you speak to that aspect? Like, how did it change the way you interacted with the Lord, like through the pain? Because I know sometimes you mentioned grief can be very isolating, but you allowed it to be something that opened up space for these questions and, like at the end, like brought you closer to the Lord.
Yeah, I think a lot of people live under the assumption, whether they acknowledge it or not, that bad things don't happen to good people. That if I
Mm.
just live the right way, that I will mostly avoid bad things happening to me. And even Christians, I think, who might say, "Yeah, that doesn't jive with what Jesus says in the Bible," we still functionally live that way. And when Rob died, I had to acknowledge that in a lot of ways, I had kind of lived that way, that our
Mm.
family life had become like an idol in my life, that I thought that maybe if I just raised my children right, if my marriage looked a certain way, that everything would go okay. And death totally exploded that lie in my life. And so I'm really grateful because what it did was grief revealed the kind of idols that I had set up in my life for the way that
Mm.
I wanted life to look, which we know, whenever we are turning to an idol, we are turning our backs on the real and living and good God who offers us something so much better. So I think
Yeah.
in that way, grief enlightened my eyes in a way that I hadn't ever experienced before. I think also in the powerlessness that came with realizing that my husband was dead, that I would never see him again, there was this
Mm.
fundamental loss of control that I had to acknowledge. That it wasn't just the idols that I had set up in my life, but I had this idea that, God and I kind of worked in tandem. Like he handled all the really hard stuff, but I could manage most of the everyday. And I would just sort of tap him for the big things like war and world peace and, dealing with
Right.
difficult extended family members. But here I had to acknowledge that if I was going to survive it all, it was entirely by the power of Jesus through the Holy Spirit. That
Mm.
the way that grief absolutely affected my body. I began to lose my hair. I had trouble sleeping. I dropped a ton of weight in the first couple of months after Rob died. My body was bearing the weight of all of that sorrow. And there were moments that I couldn't even walk up the hill to the mailbox. I was so exhausted from grief. And when I think of that, gosh, I'm like the man who had to be carried by his friends down through the roof to meet with Jesus. There were often
Mm.
times where it was all I could do to make dinner for my kids, to get the mail, to answer an email from a well meaning friend or a text from a well meaning friend, because I literally was at my weakest. And
Yeah.
it was in that moment of realizing, wow, I don't have control. I am incredibly weak, that I was able to receive really the strength of God in a way that I hadn't ever when I thought I had it all together, when, sort of Jesus was my co pilot, to allow him to really take the wheel when I had to literally sit in the passenger seat and just rest became the most life giving spiritual gift, I think, in that season for me.
Isn't that crazy how something so, like, world-shattering can draw us in so close? Like, the thing that you least expect, like, so much beauty can come out of the way that God comforts us and shows up in that, and, like, even the way that other people show up for us in that, and I would love to hear about how you processed with your kids, because I mean, it wasn't just you going through this. You had 4 kids. When life happens and people experience grief, how in the world are you supposed to keep going? Like, just waking up in the morning and putting food on the table, you know what I mean? What was that like for your kids as you were processing with them in that?
Well, I think one of the things that became really evident to me was that this was going to be complicated. And I say
Mm.
that because even as I drew closer to the Lord, as I felt the comforting presence of Jesus, I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of anger. It wasn't necessarily directed at God. It was just sort of like the kind of thrashing anger that a little child has, a toddler has when they're just
Mm.
overtired and hungry and worn out and just want to hit and smack at everything because they're
Yeah.
just so overwrought. And I think that was my experience of frustration and spiritual frustration in grief. I never asked God why. I did ask God what next. I never got angry at God because I know that God doesn't owe me anything. And yet I got angry at the church, at people around me who I felt like couldn't read my mind or take care of me in the way that I felt I needed to be cared for. And I want to
Mm.
say that because I want to acknowledge that it's not an easy spiritual path, for someone who's
Right.
experienced something hard to be able to be like, yes, this was the catalyst for spiritual growth in my life. Sometimes you come into a space after significant loss that really feels like a desert place, that feels
Mm.
a great sense of God's silence or absence. And I say that because when it came to my kids, I had to figure out how I was going to talk about the complexities of all of this in my life. How much should I share with them about this? And how much did I need to keep to myself or share with another adult friend?
Yeah.
When you lose a spouse, you've lost your sounding board, your partner, that person you tell everything to who listens to you anyways. And I
Yeah.
realized I couldn't do that with my kids. That would be really unhealthy. In fact, research tells us kids who are called up to be adults before their time have significant issues that show up later in their young adulthood. And so, what I had to do was ask myself two fundamental questions. What do my kids want to know? And what do my kids need to know? And even
Mm,
as we became a really clear team with one another, there was a lot of gatekeeping that had to happen there to help them grieve well and to help me grieve well. A lot of honest conversations where I would say, hey, I know you want to know this, but you're not old enough. When you're older, I'll explain this more fully. Or
mhm.
figuring out how this is something they really need to understand, how I'm going to tell them this in age appropriate language. A lot of it was that translation work around those two questions to help them grieve well and me grieve well at the same time.
That's really good. That's such a good perspective as well because we don't want to like overload and say too much to where it's no longer helpful. And I think that's really interesting talking about how kids that kind of have to grow up quickly, it does affect them later on. And especially with something like grief that's so marking, just a pivotal moment in life, I'm sure is just a lot to
Mhm.
process while you're processing for yourself as well. So you mentioned about how grief kind of has this way of humbling us and exposing things in us like nothing else really can. What would you say are some of the things that helped you move through the grief process in a healthy way? Because, there's obviously the extremes of I just need to get better, I need to heal, I need to go to therapy and move on. And then there's this other side of just staying stuck there and I can't see past this. There's no way I can move on. There's a middle ground somewhere in there. Or maybe is there a middle ground in
Yeah.
there somewhere? And what does that look like to grieve in a healthy way with the Lord?
Well, I really go back to Paul's words about us not being people who grieve without hope, that
Mm,
alongside of grief, there is always a glimmer of hope. Now, what does that hope look like? It's a hope that doesn't disappoint. So it is a hope in God's good plans for us to be consummated in the return of Jesus. It's not hope for feeling good now. It's not hope for things working out as we thought they would in the here and now. It's a different kind of hope altogether. And so
yeah.
grief, the very visceral and painful experience of grief, walks hand in hand with that kind of hope for the Christian. So, what does that look like? It doesn't look like pull yourself up by your bootstraps resilience. We know this
Yeah.
for children, that children are not sort of like innately resilient. People often say that, like, oh, kids are just resilient. No, they're not, actually. Resilience is something that's built, and it's built in community. The same goes for adults as well. If research tells us that adverse childhood experiences can be mitigated by even the presence of a single trusted adult in a child's life, well, that guaranteed to me, I got to have people around me, not just for practical grief support, but for the spiritual and holistic kind of support that's going to help me, as you say, not get stuck in a place of despair, but also not sort of fast track me through the emotions as though I need to get it over with. I'm going to need to find
Yeah.
companions who allow me to feel the feels and feel the depth of that and also draw me forward. For me, a lot of that was the companionship of folks at church. It was friends and family who were present, but also the companionship showed up in funny places. My electrician, who kind of took it upon himself to be like an uncle to our family, teach my boys how to hang the microwave in the kitchen and rewire things around the house. It was the HVAC guy who showed up at my doorstep for the first time after my husband died with tears in his eyes, saying, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize what had happened. Um,
Mm.
he had read about it in the news. This is the kind of thing that was the web of community that began to grow up around me, and it required some of that vulnerability to grieve with hope, to grieve and say, I'm hopeful enough about what Jesus can do in resurrection that I'm going to get vulnerable and tell this person that I'm actually not doing well today, in hopes that there can be a resurrection moment here in you saying, wow, I'm so sorry. Can I sit with you? Can I say I love you? Can I say I'm sorry? Can I say I'll stick around? We take that risk when we carry grief and hope in the same hand, because the hope could be dashed, and we could only be left with grief. But we have the confidence when grief and hope are walking hand in hand with Jesus as our very best companion, that we
Mm.
can do this hard thing without shouldering through, without having to hide, because we walk with the friend who was acquainted with grief, as Isaiah says. He was a friend of sorrow.
Yeah.
He knows exactly how to do this, and he can be our very best guide.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that you emphasize the hope in this because I feel like as Christians in this conversation about grief, like we have something so precious to hold on to that the rest of the world does not. And it's not that having this hope in Christ dissolves the pain of it or the trauma or anything like that, but that we have something so real to cling to alleviates some of the weight of it, I guess. We have hope that there will be joy again, like you mentioned in the beginning. I would love to know a little bit more about how that kind of developed in you through the grieving process because I've experienced some loss in my own life, of course, different, but I went through some miscarriages. And then I have friends who have gone through, loss of siblings, parents, things like that. There's so many kinds of grief and loss that we experience in this life. But I'd love to know for the days where it's just really hard. I'm thinking of, times when I almost got scared to get my hopes up again. Because I
Yeah.
was like, I don't want to be disappointed. Like, I don't want to open myself up to the hope. Like, the hope is almost a little scary. Or when you get to the point where you're like, okay, I do see that I am healing. The grief isn't gone, but I almost feel guilty for moving on. Like there's that sense of like, is it okay to move on? Is it okay to feel joy again? Like, how do you hold those nuanced pieces of the puzzle?
That's a great question, and it brings to mind my own experience when I get my blood drawn. I do not like medical things at all. I would avoid it at all costs, and so when I go to the doctor, when I go to get my blood drawn, I really don't know where to look in a doctor's office. I have to look at the ground because as soon as I start looking at stuff that's attached to the walls, the posters, the boxes, all kinds of stuff, I get woozy. I've got to lie down. They have to offer me apple juice. It's just a whole scene. And so I feel very constrained when I'm in that moment. It's as though I have no hope. I have nowhere that I
Mm,
can look that feels safe. And I think when we have experienced significant loss, whether it is in a miscarriage, whether it is the loss of a relationship through divorce, even a job loss that really we realized was so centered around our identity, we have the same feeling of, I got to just look at the ground because I don't know where to look. Every place I lift
mm,
my eyes is a risk for me. It's a risk of
right.
hope. And I think that's so normal. It's a self protective measure for us. And it's okay to live in that space for a little while because hurt is deep, it cuts deep. And sometimes we don't have the wherewithal to be able to lift our eyes. And the reality is that even though we can't do that, there is a light for us. God says he is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Look at that. Just as your eyes are tuned to the ground, there's a light right there. You may not have
Mm.
realized it. You thought you had to look to a light on the horizon, but no, it's right there at your feet. And I think this is the promise that God gives to us of hope in those very darkest moments where it's like, Lord, I don't even know where to look right now. I'm afraid to look at the past. It makes me too sad. I'm afraid to look at the future. It makes me scared. I'm stuck in the present looking at my feet. And he says, look,
Yeah.
here's a light right here, a
Mm.
light at your feet. I think of the phrase from Great is Thy Faithfulness, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. And for most folks who are experiencing significant loss and pain, strength for today is probably as far as we get. And
Mhm.
so for me, hope has been sometimes an hour by hour discipline. Okay, Lord, I just trusted you with the last hour. I'm going to trust you with the next one. I'm going to
Yeah.
trust you with the next hour. And the amazing thing is, as we do that little by little and little by little over time, the Lord gently lifts our head. I mean, this is what the psalmist said. He is the lifter of my head. He lifts my head from being trained at the ground where I think I'm only safe to look down. And he allows me to look toward the strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. But I think it's a
Mm,
process, and it's a process that looks different for each person, which is where the church is so precious as a
yeah.
hospital for sinners and saints, because everybody with their wounds is welcome in a space like that. And there's absolutely no timeline. I used to tell kids when I worked in
Yeah.
children's ministry, when they were running through the hallways, I would say, there is never a rush in God's house. And even though that was a statement to try to get some walking feet out of them, it is a core theological truth that the
Mm.
Lord is slow and gentle with those who are brokenhearted. And we can give ourselves all the time we need.
Yes, I love that. And I'm so grateful that you bring that up because I do think there's almost this pressure to just power through the hard stuff because I'm a good Christian or that idea of like I'm a good person, bad things don't happen. Like what do I do with this? Like this doesn't fit into the mold of what I thought a good Christian was or what a good God is and like what do I do with this thing that I don't want? But it's happening and you just one step at a time, 1 hour at a time. And I think it's so freeing in that to give yourself permission to just feel and to go in the process and to ask for help when you need it and to be
Yeah.
vulnerable when you're vulnerable because I know for me like when I experienced some grief for the first time or like the first time I felt a really traumatic loss in my life, I felt so unsafe. It's so scary. But to know that we have a God whose presence is so safe, like safest place we could be, holding all of our pain and the questions that we feel and the confusion and even the anger. Like you mentioned, we have someone where we can carry all of that and we don't have to self-diagnose or like figure out why. We can just bring the mess. And he's so kind and he's so present. I love that he's so present to those who are brokenhearted.
Mhm.
So I would love to know before we go if there's any last advice or encouragement you want to leave with the women who are listening, or maybe there's a woman who's experiencing a loss or in the throes of grief right now. And she's like, I want to believe that there's hope for tomorrow, but I really can't even see my hand in front of me right now. I feel so broken down and heavy with this grief. What would you say to her?
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that Jesus gets it. We know from the death of Lazarus that Jesus wept over his friend's death.
Mm,
He raged against the costliness of sin in the life of someone's life that he loved. And so we know that God is just as frustrated and angry about the brokenness of the world as we are. He sees the injustice of death. And
yeah.
that's why he came to bring a solution to it. And so, even as we wait for all things to be made new, we can be assured that Jesus, who bears the scars, I love that on the road to Emmaus, that he shows his disciples his wounds, and then they know who he is. We're known in our
Yeah.
woundedness. That it is this one who came to be with us in woundedness, who has risen to show us that our wounds define us, but they do not ever constrain us when we are connected with God the Father. This is our hope. He is our very best companion. And if he could rise again, he can bring us to life again. And it'll be little by little, it'll take the time it takes. But this is the sure hope that is, as scripture says, an anchor for our souls. And, I live by the ocean about 10 miles as the crow flies. I was just over there with my boys surfing yesterday. We love the ocean. But there's a funny thing about anchors. You can't see them when they're doing their work most of the time.
Mm.
They are deep, deep below those waves, deep below that surface. And sometimes it just requires a little tug on the rope to make sure that you know that the anchor holds. And the truth is that the Lord, through his word, has given us the opportunity to tug at that rope over and over again in the community of the faithful, in our faith communities and church. He gives us the opportunity to tug that rope, to be able to be reassured that he is faithful, that he is strong, that he is good and will accomplish all that concerns us. So even when you can't see the anchor, it's holding you fast.
That is so beautiful. I'm so grateful for you, Clarissa, for your willingness to share your story and to just be honest about the hard, good process of grief and faith and navigating the ups and downs of this journey through the lens of hope that we have in the Lord. So thank you so much for being here. Where can everybody go to stay connected with you from here?
Sure. Visit me at clarissamall.com. It's where you can find out more about my books. I'm a co host of Surprised by Grief podcast. So if you're a person who's grieving and want to feel a sense of connection, you can follow my story through my first year of loss with my co host, Daniel Harrell, who shares about his loss of his wife to pancreas cancer. And we just talk about it all, what it's like to raise kids through loss, what it's like to lose a partner through cancer or sudden loss, just to give folks a sense that as they walk through their unique and sacred grief journey, that they are not alone.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being here. You guys know I'll make sure everything is linked so that you can go connect with Clarissa. But I am just so grateful for your story and grateful that you were here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in to another episode of the Byword Show. I love having you here, and your support truly means the world to me. If you enjoyed this episode, would you leave a quick review? It really helps our community grow and reach more women. If you want more, you can shop my books, Waking Up, Living Open, and Love Is on Amazon, and be sure to sign up for my email list so you always get the latest news. I can't wait to chat again soon, but in the meantime, be sure to come hang out with me on social media, and remember, I'm cheering you on.